In the 80s movie The Terminator, the hero Kyle Reese travels to LA to find and protect Sarah Connor from a Terminator, a robotic assassin sent back through time to kill her. He explains that he's from a future which has been devastated by nuclear war, a war which was triggered by Skynet, a sentient military computer which had been given the ability to launch a nuclear strike if it deemed that it was necessary. It's a classic movie, but thankfully it's just a movie. There's no element of truth to it, right? Well, okay, maybe we don't have rogue, sentient AIs running our nuclear arsenals just yet, but there is apparently an automated computer system developed by Soviet technicians that is designed to ensure that in the event of a nuclear attack on Russia, global annihilation will follow, even if there are no humans left to give the order. It's a last option fail-deadly system, in other words, a Doomsday device. Developed in the mid-1980s and officially known as the Perimeter System, the people who worked on it called it Mrtvaya Ruka, or the Dead Hand. To understand why the Russians would even build such a device, it helps to get a feeling of the time period in which it was developed. It was an era characterised by spying, paranoia, and the constant threat of nuclear war, an era that we know today as the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had two opposing nuclear superpowers and their relative allies constantly vying to get the edge over each other, hoping to gain some advantage, to get some leverage they could use to persuade your enemy not to attack. For years, both sides have been producing and stockpiling ever more powerful nuclear warheads, and by the 1980s there were enough nuclear weapons in existence to basically destroy the entire world several times over. The US had over 31,000 warheads and the USSR had over 40,000 warheads. A cynical view of the situation was that the arms race had led us to a very dangerous stalemate, which was the equivalent of two men standing in a swimming pool full of petrol posturing about who had the most matches. The situation did have one advantage though, and that's that it was MAD, as in M-A-D, MAD, mutually assured destruction. Neither side could win a nuclear war, and as a result, nobody was willing to start one. However, all that seemingly changed with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. Unlike the previous American president, Jimmy Carter, Reagan was much more confrontational with the Soviet Union. During the Carter years, the Soviet view was that the US was somewhat weak and ineffectual, suffering economic recession at the hands of the OPEC oil nations and a loss of confidence following the defeat in the Vietnam War. Reagan wanted to put that impression firmly in the past, and he seemed definitely to be gearing up with some sort of a showdown with the Soviet Union. In a speech he gave in 1983, Reagan described the USSR as the evil empire, the focus of all evil in the modern world. Later that year, he announced the coming deployment of the SDI, informally known as the Star Wars program. This would be a network of satellites that was in orbit above the US. They were to be outfitted with powerful lasers that were capable of destroying Soviet nuclear missiles whilst they were still in flight. In theory, Star Wars would protect the United States from any Soviet nuclear attack, giving the US an unprecedented advantage and destabilising the precious stalemate which by then had existed for a couple of decades. By 1983, US-Soviet relations were strained to breaking point. The shooting down of a South Korean airliner by Russian military jets over the Kamchatka Peninsula and the increasingly belligerent rhetoric of the Reagan administration had many feeling like nuclear war was almost inevitable, and this was reflected in the songs, the films, even the computer games of that time. According to Cold War expert Bruce Blair, things had deteriorated to the point where the entire apparatus of the Soviet Union as a system was geared to expect a nuclear attack and retaliate to it very quickly. The USSR was on a hair trigger alert. It was very nervous and prone to mistakes and accidents. History shows that Reagan had in fact no intention of using nuclear weapons against the USSR, but the Soviet leadership had become convinced that not only could America win a nuclear war, but that Reagan's goal was complete world domination, and he was willing to nuke the USSR to get it. and it was in these dark and very stressful times that the dead hand system was put into operation. The reasoning behind the creation of Dead Hand was twofold. Firstly, the Soviet generals believed that they had effectively lost the ability to protect themselves from a decapitation strike, a limited nuclear attack designed to take out the Soviet leadership and key military installations. They believed that the Star Wars program, those laser satellites that were in orbit, could never hope to shoot down a full-scale nuclear attack from the USSR. So if Reagan was being so gung-ho about the US's ability to defend itself, then, they thought, he must be talking about a limited response from the USSR, which, logically, would only be a retaliatory strike, i.e. after America had already bombed Moscow. With the new submarines and missiles in Western Europe, the West could attack the USSR with only 3 minutes' notice, which was not enough time for the Soviets to respond. All the evidence seemingly pointed to just one scenario. The US had the ability, and apparently was now willing, to nuke the USSR in a first strike. And therefore, a backup was needed, something so terrible that it would ensure that there would be no winner if the USSR was ever attacked. The second reason for creating Dead Hand is that it would take some of the pressure off the Soviet generals to strike first. With the US seemingly already having won the Cold War, there were some in the Soviet military who openly advocated for striking first against America. In this deadly game of nuclear brinkmanship, the Dead Hand could act as a kind of Plan B, a fail-safe backup which ensured retaliation no matter what. The Dead Hand could be used to cool down all these hotheads and extremists. No matter what was going to happen, there would still be revenge. Those who attack us will be punished. So if there really is a 1980s Doomsday weapon that's still operational today, how would it even work? Well, what details we have come from a former Soviet colonel, Valery Yarovich, who now lives in the US. He helped develop and implement the construction of the Dead Hand system, and according to him, it goes something like this. The computer system itself is located in a deep bunker somewhere south of Moscow, and in times of relative calm, it's kept in a semi-dormant state, a kind of sleep mode. However, in times of heightened tensions, kind of like the present time we're currently living in, the system is kept fully active at all times. The computer's linked to a vast array of sensors. These are most likely radiation, air pressure, and seismic sensors. And the computer scans constantly for signs of a nuclear explosion anywhere on the surface of Soviet territory. At the same time, Dead Hand is also constantly checking to see if it has any line of communications open to the war room of the Soviet General Staff. Now, if Dead Hand detects a nuclear explosion and all communication with the war room is lost, then the computer's programmed to assume that the USSR has been attacked and that there are no longer any high-ranking military staff remaining to order a counterattack. And in this scenario, one of two things may happen, we're not exactly sure. First option would be a fully automated counterattack that's launched by the computer. Or, what's more likely, is that command authority to launch a full-scale counterattack is transferred to a secondary controlled bunker, which is believed to be deep under the Ural Mountains. This is just a small bunker, and it's manned by only a couple of soldiers. And whoever happens to be on duty in the bunker, and this could be like anybody, no matter how junior they might be, this person has complete authority to launch all of Russia's remaining nuclear weapons. If that order ever comes, either from the Dead Hand computer or the human proxy in the bunker, several command missiles are launched. These missiles, which are kept in hardened silos and designed to withstand any attack, would fly around over Russia, transmitting launch instructions to any and all remaining Soviet missiles. And by this point it's all automatic, there's no more human intervention. The entire Soviet nuclear arsenal is launched on whatever predetermined targets were set. The ensuing devastation would most likely be enough not only to destroy all remaining enemies, but could plunge the entire planet into a nuclear winter. So in that case, if the Russians lose, we all lose. Now, none of what I've described has ever been fully confirmed or denied by the Russians, which leads me to question just how much of this story is actually true. I mean, why bother having a Doomsday device, an ultimate weapon, if your enemy doesn't know anything about it? By keeping Dead Hand a secret, doesn't it just defeat the whole purpose of it? Well, one answer might be that if the Americans don't know about it, they can't hack it and they can't disable it. Another answer might be that it was never really meant to act as a deterrent in the first place. When the system was put in place, the Soviet leader was Konstantin Chernenko, seriously ill 72-year-old suffering from last-stage emphysema who stuttered, mumbled, barely held documents in his hands, and had trouble understanding what he was reading. And if this is the man who, in a crisis, is the commander-in-chief, then maybe from a Soviet perspective, a system like Dead Hand was the best solution under the circumstances. And most experts today agree that Dead Hand does indeed exist, although the degree of autonomy it has is still unclear, as it's all highly classified information. In 2011, the commander of the Russian Strategic Missile Forces confirmed the existence of Perimeter, as they call it, and stated that it remains operational and on alert. Back in 1992, the former deputy chief of the staff of Russian Strategic Rocket Forces also stated that they had a system to be activated only during a crisis that would automatically launch all of Russia's nuclear missiles. It would be triggered by a combination of light, radioactivity, pressure sensors, and would work even if every nuclear command centre and all the leadership had been destroyed. Over the years, rumours have abounded that the system has been upgraded, it hasn't been deactivated, and it continues to be upgraded on a regular basis. The latest rumour is that they've been incorporating neural computers into the command centre. So we're left with a scenario where it is entirely possible that we're living in a world where a kind of a version of Skynet, the fictional computer from those Terminator movies, does actually exist, which, if you think about it, is just terrifying. But, as the old saying goes, there's no point worrying about things that are completely out of your control, so it's probably best not to worry about Dead Hand. Just hope that those upgrades took into account things like cyber attacks, meteor strikes, a reactor meltdown, or a possible nuclear attack from a terrorist group. If they've got all those bases covered, we can probably all sleep soundly at night. And if they haven't, well, I guess one day we'll definitely find out whether or not Dead Hand really exists.